Welcome back. This is part 3 of The Secret of the Old Clock story. Let's continue the journey with the new chapter, Chapter 13, titled An Adventure.
Nancy Drew had made up her mind to visit the Topham cottage the very next day, but in making her plans, she had counted without Helen Corning and her friends. They were unwilling that she should be alone even for a minute. From the moment she awoke in the morning and sniffed the fragrant odor of the pines, she was rushed from one thing to another. After a breakfast of fruit, fried eggs, crisp bacon, and hot cornbread, she was pressed into a tennis game. The afternoon was devoted to swimming and water polo. By evening, Nancy Drew was so tired she could scarcely keep her eyes open, and she was thankful for the opportunity of tumbling into bed. "Tomorrow I simply must find a way to visit the Topham cottage," she told herself just before she dropped off to sleep. Immediately after breakfast the following morning, Helen Corning announced the plan for the day. "The girls have decided on an all-day hike into the woods, Nancy. You'll go, won't you?" Nancy groaned. "You're wearing me to a frazzle, Helen. Please let me off this time. I'd like to stay in camp today and just rest up." "Well, all right," Helen agreed unwillingly. "I'll stay with you." "Oh, no," Nancy protested vigorously. "I won't let you do that. You like to hike so well. Please go on. I'll have a good time all by myself. Really, I will." "I don't like to leave you, Nancy, but if you insist—" "I do, Helen. Please don't worry about me. I'll have a good time here. If you don't mind, I may take the launch out while you're gone." "If you do, you'd better not go far," Helen advised her. "We girls bought it second-hand for a song, and it's my private opinion the engine isn't much good." "I'll be careful," Nancy promised. She could scarcely hide her eagerness to be off, but she was forced to wait until Helen and her friends had started on their hike. It seemed to Nancy that they would never leave, but at last they trudged away with their knapsacks slung over their shoulders. "You'll wish you had gone too," Helen called back over her shoulder. As soon as the girls were out of sight, Nancy hurried down to the launch, which was tied to the dock not far from the camp. She examined the engine. She had frequently handled motorboats, but never one of this particular make. "I believe I can manage it all right, if only I can get the engine started," Nancy told herself. She discovered a pin sunk in the rim of a flywheel, and after adjusting other parts, pulled it out rather timidly. She gave the wheel a vigorous turn to the right. She tried again, swinging it farther and snapping back hard. To her delight, the engine began to roar. Cutting down the motor, Nancy steered out into deep water. At first, she followed the shore, but as she became more familiar with the wheel, and as the engine appeared to work perfectly, she headed out into the lake. Nancy experienced a real thrill as the little launch responded to her hand. The lake was as smooth as glass, and there was scarcely a cloud in the sky. As the launch cut through the water, a tiny spray blew in Nancy's face, but she did not mind. Far ahead, she could see the opposite shore, and she headed straight for the point where she knew the Topham bungalow was located. "If only the caretaker will let me in when I get there," she thought as she drew near her objective point. But she was doomed never to reach the opposite shore that day, for unexpectedly there was a miss in the steady throb of the engine. The motor gave one long, slow wheeze and died. "Oh, what can have happened to it now?" Nancy cried anxiously. "I can't have run out of gasoline." An examination of the tank revealed that it was nearly full. Nancy studied the engine doubtfully. Like most girls, she had never interested herself in the mechanics of what made wheels go around. "Hateful thing," she murmured. "It believes it stopped on purpose." Too late, Nancy recalled that her chum had warned her about the engine. Now, as she glanced toward shore, she saw no hope of rescue. She was within sight of the Topham bungalow, which appeared deserted, but miles from her own camp. For nearly an hour she worked over the engine, but her efforts were useless. The stubborn motor refused to start. "I'll have to sit out here all day," Nancy thought miserably. "This means I won't get to visit the Topham cottage after all." It was especially tantalizing to be so close to the bungalow and yet know that she could not reach it. Nancy was tempted to swim, but she gave up the idea almost as quickly as it occurred to her, for she realized that even if she reached the Topham bungalow, she would have no means of returning to camp. she decided that it would be better to remain on the lake and wait for a passing boat to rescue her. Slowly the hours dragged on, and the launch drifted farther and farther from shore. Never had time seemed to pass so monotonously. "There's one thing certain," Nancy Drew told herself. "If I ever get out of this launch, I'll never set foot in it again." The camp boat seemed to be the only one on the lake, and as the day wore on, she began to wonder if she ever would be rescued. The sun beat down upon her, and with the passing hours, she became hungry as well as uncomfortable. "After today, I'll never have another chance to visit the Topham cottage alone," she thought. "Helen means well, but she will stay with me every minute. I think the best thing I can do is tell her I'm starting for home tomorrow. That is, if I'm ever lucky enough to reach shore. On my way back to River Heights, I'll stop at the Topham cottage. Helen will be disappointed, but it can't be helped." For want of other occupation, Nancy turned her attention again to the engine. When the sun sank into the water several hours later, she was still bending over it, a determined look in her eyes. "There," she muttered as she straightened up. "I've certainly done enough to it. If it won't go now, it never will." She gave the wheel a vicious swing, and to her astonishment, the engine began its steady roar as unconcerned as though it had never stopped. "If that isn't the limit!" Nancy exclaimed in wonder. Hopefully, she glanced toward shore, but already shadows were beginning to lurk among the trees, and she knew that in less than an hour it would be dark. "It's too late to visit the bungalow tonight," she decided regretfully. "I'd better get back to camp before this engine changes its mind again." Obedient to her will, the little launch plowed through the water towards camp, its engine laboring faithfully. As she eased up to the dock, Nancy saw Helen and her friends just trudging into camp. They hailed her with delight. "I'm nearly dead," Helen announced. "You were smart to stay in camp." She stopped abruptly and stared at her chum. "Why, you're all sunburned and you're covered with grease. What have you been doing?" "Taking a sun bath," laughed Nancy. "By the way, Helen, you were right about that engine, but I don't think it will give you any more trouble this summer. Anyway, I've donated 8 hours to the cause." "8 hours?" Helen gasped. "You've not been out on the lake all that time." "It served me right, I guess. I should have gone on the hike." But while Nancy made light of her adventure, she was disappointed. She had wasted a day, and time was precious. Would she ever reach the Topham cottage? So far, she had been thwarted at every turn.
This marks the end of Chapter 13. We now move into the next chapter of story, Chapter 14, titled An Exciting Discovery.
"Nancy Drew, why are you packing that suitcase? You're not leaving camp already." Helen Corning, entering the cabin which she shared with Nancy, stopped in the doorway and stared in amazement at her chum, who was folding wearing apparel carefully into her suitcase. "I'm afraid I must leave this afternoon," Nancy admitted regretfully. "But you've been here only 3 days," Helen protested. "Don't you like the camp?" "Oh, I've had a wonderful time," Nancy cried impulsively. "And the girls have been so nice to me. I'd love to stay, but I can't. There's something important I must attend to at once." "Can it wait?" "I'm afraid not. I've waited too long already." "But the dance, Nancy, you don't want to miss it." "I don't want to, Helen, but I really must go this afternoon." "I can't understand what's made you change your mind so suddenly. It wasn't that horrid experience in the launch, was it?" Nancy Drew laughed and shook her head. She could not tell Helen her real reason for departing. So long as she remained at camp, she knew that Helen and her friends would not leave her alone for a minute. It would be impossible to visit the Topham bungalow on the opposite side of the lake without offering explanations, and Nancy was unwilling to disclose the purpose of her trip. In spite of Helen's teasing, she remained firm in her decision to leave camp. Directly after lunching, she slung her suitcase into the roadster and took leave of the girls. Regretfully, they watched her go. "Now, if only I can find my way to the Topham bungalow," Nancy thought. The previous day, she had casually inquired from Helen which road led to the Topham bungalow, but the directions had been rather hazy. Coming to a fork, she selected the left-hand road, which appeared to circle the lake. As Helen had indicated, it was winding and narrow and richly sprinkled with sharp rocks. From camp, it was comparatively easy to reach the Topham bungalow by launch, but the distance around the lake was nearly 8 miles. Nancy was forced to drive slowly, and had she met another car, it would have been difficult to have passed. In places, the road was muddy, for overhanging trees and bushes protected the moist earth from the rays of the sun. The going was especially hard because of 2 deep ruts, which apparently had been made by a heavy truck. "I wonder what a truck was doing up this road," Nancy mused, somewhat curiously. "The tracks appear to have been made today, too." As she drove along, she noticed a number of summer cottages, but as the season was late, nearly all were boarded up. At last she came within sight of a clearing and through the trees caught a glimpse of the Topham bungalow. "I hope I'll find the caretaker," she thought. "I'd certainly hate to go back without seeing him." Not without a feeling of anxiety, she stopped the roadster at the edge of the road. To her surprise, she observed that the tracks made by the truck did not continue further. Apparently, the truck had turned in toward the bungalow. Nancy hurried up the path. As she emerged among the trees, she stopped short and stared in amazement ahead. The entire camp was in disarray. The front door of the bungalow had been flung wide open, and the side doors were likewise ajar. An overturned chair had been dropped carelessly on the porch, and a trail of knickknacks stretched from the house to the path. The grass had been trampled, and there were peculiar marks in the soft earth. "There's something strange about this," Nancy murmured. Quickly, she bent down to examine the marks, which were clearly visible. At a glance, she saw that the footprints had been caused by heavy boots, and there were long lines evidently caused by dragging boxes and furniture across the lawn. "I think I'm beginning to see the light," Nancy told herself. "Now I know what that truck was doing on this road. Unquestionably, it was a moving van, and it came here." Again, she examined the imprints in the soft earth. "These marks couldn't have been made more than an hour ago, at the latest," she decided. As she hurried on up the path, it appeared to Nancy that the camp was deserted. There was no sign of Jeff Tucker, the colored caretaker in whose care the Topham bungalow had been entrusted. Reaching the veranda, Nancy knocked loudly on the door. When there was no response, she boldly entered. "What can this mean?" she asked herself in dismay as she stared at the sight before her. The living room was in confusion. Save for a few pieces, it was bare of furniture. Even the draperies and curtains had been ripped from their rods. The rugs were missing, as was everything else of value. To Nancy's astonishment, she found that with the exception of one room, the entire house had been ransacked. Only one bedroom had been left practically untouched, and as she stepped into it, she noticed that the rug had been rolled up and securely tied, as though in preparation for moving. As Nancy gazed at the disorder about her, she searched her mind for an explanation. What could it mean? "It looks like a case of ordinary robbery to me," she reasoned. Nancy had frequently read of cases where the summer homes of wealthy persons had been stripped of furniture and rugs by unscrupulous robbers who sold the valuables to second-hand dealers and fences. In recent years, there had been a number of thefts in the vicinity of Moon Lake, and as a protective measure, many of the cottage owners employed caretakers the year round. What had become of Jeff Tucker, the colored man who had been left in charge of the Topham bungalow? The place seemed deserted. Nancy realized that the Topham bungalow, which had been expensively furnished, would offer a rich prize for thieves. Now, as she viewed the evidence, the suspicion that lurked in her mind developed into firm conviction. She was certain that robbers had ransacked the place, carrying off nearly everything of value. They must have taken the Crowley clock, too, Nancy told herself, with a sinking heart. A feeling of desperation came over the girl as she realized that again she had been thwarted. It seemed almost as though a cruel fate had ordained that the mystery of the missing Crowley will should forever remain unsolved. "It's barely possible the robbers overlooked the clock," Nancy thought hopefully. She began to look around in nooks and corners of the bungalow. She opened closets and poked about in drawers, but her search was in vain. She found no clock. As Nancy returned to the bedroom, she regarded it meditatively. Why had the robbers left this one room practically untouched? Certainly the furniture was as valuable as that which they had taken. Unquestionably, the thieves intended to strip the room, for they had rolled up the rug. "I wonder if they heard me coming and were frightened away," Nancy asked herself. "I didn't see a sign of their truck, and yet I'm sure they couldn't have left here many minutes before I arrived." As the thought occurred to her, she glanced uneasily over her shoulder.
She realized she was buried in a wilderness some miles from the nearest house, and the knowledge of unscrupulous men being in the vicinity was anything but reassuring. What if those robbers were still around here? Flashed through her mind. As Nancy Drew listened tensely, the very silence of the empty house was startling. A strange feeling came over her. She could almost sense that someone was watching her every movement.
This marks the end of Chapter 14. We now move into the next chapter of story, Chapter 15, titled A Desperate Situation.
How silly of me to be afraid, Nancy Drew laughed nervously. Probably there isn't a person within miles of here. As she glanced about the bungalow, it was with relief that she assured herself the place was deserted. Yet for some reason she was unable to free herself entirely from the feeling that an unseen danger lurked in wait for her. The very walls seemed to smirk and grimace at her, and there was an ominous something in the air. Now that Nancy felt certain that the Crowley clock had been stolen, she was anxious to get away from the Topham bungalow as quickly as possible. "I'll drive to the nearest town and report the robbery to the police," she decided. "Those men won't be able to travel very fast with a heavy moving van. There's a chance that they may be caught yet." Having made the decision, Nancy moved toward the front door. Passing a window, she chanced to glance out, and what she saw caused her to pause in sheer fright. A heavy-set man with a cap pulled low over his eyes was coming up the path toward the house. For a moment, Nancy Drew was held in a paralysis of fear. She was positive that the man who was coming toward her was one of the members of the robber band. Only an instant did the girl hesitate. Then she turned and ran back into the bedroom. Too late, she saw that she had trapped herself, for this room had no outside door. Nancy started back toward the living room, but before she had taken half a dozen steps, she realized that her escape had been cut off from that direction. The man had reached the veranda steps. Frantically, she glanced about for a hiding place. The bedroom closet offered the only possible refuge, and with scarcely an instant's hesitation, she stepped into it and closed the door behind her. Nancy was not a minute too soon. Scarcely had she shut the door when she heard the heavy tread of a man's hobnail shoes on the floor. Peeping cautiously out through a tiny crack in the door, she saw a rough-looking man come into the bedroom. His face was cold and cruel. As he turned toward the closet where she huddled, Nancy Drew held her breath, scarcely daring to breathe naturally lest her presence be detected. Apparently, the man noticed nothing amiss, for his eyes rested only casually on the closet door. Nancy's hiding place was anything but comfortable. It was dark and musty, and old clothing hung from nails. As dust assailed her nostrils, she held a handkerchief to her face lest she sneeze. "If I sneeze, they'll be sure to find me," she told herself. "They'll know well enough it isn't an animal, even a cat." She felt around and once came close to catching her hand on a sharp nail. Then she felt something soft on a shelf and imagined it was a sleeping cat. She drew back, then felt more cautiously. "Only an old fur cap," she told herself in disgust, "and probably full of moths. Gracious, now I feel like sneezing worse than ever." She held her hand over her mouth hard and waited in agony, but presently the desire to sneeze passed, and Nancy breathed more freely. When she dared to peep out through the crack a second time, she saw that 2 other men had come into the room. From their appearance, she knew that they must be members of the robber gang. The first man seemed to be their leader, for he proceeded to issue orders. "Get a move on. We haven't got all day unless we want to be caught. Take that dresser out of here first." The 2 men lifted the heavy piece of furniture and started with it to the door, but they did not move swiftly enough to satisfy the leader, and he berated them savagely. "If you were in such a hurry, why didn't you back the van up to the door instead of leaving it hidden in the bushes?" one of the men retorted angrily. "Yes, and have someone see us from the road," sneered the leader. "Well, carry this out yourself if you think it's so light." From her hiding place, Nancy Drew watched the men as they deliberately stripped the room of everything valuable. Piece by piece, they carried out the furniture, but the girl was given no opportunity to escape, for the leader of the gang remained in the room while the others made the trip to the van. "Well, I guess we have everything now," the leader muttered at last.
He turned to follow his companions, who had already gone to the truck, but in the doorway paused for a last careful survey of the room. At that fateful moment, there came a muffled sneeze from the closet. The robber wheeled about. Walking directly to the closet, he flung open the door and exposed poor Nancy, who was crouching in the far corner. Angrily, he jerked her out. "Spying on us, eh?" he snarled. "I wasn't spying." Nancy Drew eyed the man defiantly. "Then what were you doing in that closet?" "I came to see the caretaker." "Looking for him in a funny place, ain't you?" the man sneered. Nancy realized that she was in a desperate situation. The look on the robber's face frightened her. "I heard someone coming and I was afraid," she explained lamely. "Well, it was unhealthy business that brought you here," the man told her sharply. "What did you hear in that closet?" Without giving her an opportunity to answer the question, he added with a scowl, "I warn you, this will be the last time you ever stick your nose in business that doesn't concern you." As Nancy saw the expression on the man's face, there was no mistaking the ugly threat. One glance assured her that she could expect no mercy. The hopelessness of her situation gave her the courage to defy him. "I'm not heard much, but I saw plenty," she cried. "You're nothing but a common thief, and if I get the chance, I'll turn you and your gang over to the police." "If you get the chance, that's good," the robber laughed mirthlessly. "I'll do with you as I did the caretaker." "The caretaker?" Nancy gasped in horror. "What have you done with him?" "You'll find out in all good time." The man held Nancy's wrists in a vice-like grip. Her efforts to free herself were of no avail. "It won't do you any good to try to get away," her captor informed her. Nancy was desperate. Suddenly, utilizing every ounce of her strength, she gave her imprisoned wrists a quick upward jerk. As the action tore her hands free, she darted for the door. With a cry of rage, the robber was after her. Almost in one long leap, he overtook her, caught her roughly by the arm, and forced her against the wall. "Not much you don't," he snarled. "Not much you don't." Nancy Drew struggled this way and that. She twisted and squirmed. She kicked and clawed, but she was powerless in the grip of the man. "Little wildcat, you won't do any more scratching when I get through with you." "Let me go," Nancy cried, struggling harder. The man half-carried, half-dragged her across the room. Opening the closet door, he flung her roughly inside. Nancy heard a key turn in the lock. The sliding of a bolt into place followed. "Now you can starve for all I care," the man laughed harshly. Then the steady tromp of his heavy boots across the floor told Nancy Drew that he had left the house.
This marks the end of Chapter 15. We now move into the next chapter of story, Chapter 16, titled Left to Starve.
When the sound of the footsteps had died away, Nancy Drew was overcome with panic. A feeling of desperation came over her. She realized that the robber had dared to carry out his ugly threat. He had locked her in the closet and had left her there to starve. At first, Nancy was too frightened to think logically. She beat frantically upon the door with her fists, but the heavy oak panels did not give. "Help! Help!" she screamed. At last, exhausted by her efforts to force the door open, she fell down upon the floor, a dejected, crushed little figure. "Maybe those men will come back later and let me out," she tried to encourage herself. "Surely they can't be so heartless as to leave me here to starve." But even as the thought came to her, she heard the muffled roar of a heavy truck as it passed the Topham bungalow on the way to the road. With a feeling of utter hopelessness, Nancy heard the van depart. She knew for a certainty the cruel, hardened rascals were indifferent to her plight. They had abandoned her to a horrible fate. The house was as silent as a tomb. Although Nancy had little hope that there was anyone within miles of the cottage, she again raised her voice and shouted for help. Her cries echoed through the empty house and seemed to mock her. "Oh, why didn't I have sense enough to tell Helen Corning where I was going?" she thought miserably. "She believed I was starting for home. The girls will never dream that I came here." And her father thought that she intended to remain at the camp for a week. He would not become alarmed over her absence until it was too late. Oh, if only she had never left her home in River Heights. Someone may find my roadster at the side of the road, Nancy reasoned, but it isn't very likely. Few persons pass this way so late in the season. What had become of Jeff Tucker, the caretaker? Certainly she could expect no aid from that quarter. The robber had hinted that he had done away with the old colored man, and, knowing the character of the rascals, it was impossible not to believe the worst. As the full significance of the situation dawned upon the girl, panic again took possession of her. In a desperate attempt to break down the door, she threw her weight against it again and again. She pounded upon the panels until her fingers were bruised and bleeding. At last, she sank down on the floor to rest and tried to force herself to reason calmly. I'm only wasting my strength this way. I must try to think logically. If I don't, I'm lost. Nancy Drew recalled that she had once read that it was possible to pick a lock with a hairpin. Feeling in her hair, she found a heavy wire one and began to work at the lock. But in the darkness she could not see, and she made little progress. After 15 minutes, she gave the task up in disgust. That's no use, she decided miserably. I'm afraid I'll never get out. She began to think of her father, of Helen Corning, and other dear friends. Would she ever see them again? As despondency claimed Nancy, she was dangerously near tears. Resolutely, she tried to shake off the mood. This will never do, she told herself sternly. Surely there is a way to get out of here. I must keep my head and try to think of something. After a time, as a new idea occurred to the girl, she began to rummage about in the closet, hoping that by some lucky chance she might find a tool which would help her force the lock of the door. She searched carefully through every pocket of every garment that hung from the hooks. She groped over every inch of the floor. She found nothing of value, and the cloud of dust which was stirred up made breathing more difficult than before. The closet had become uncomfortably warm by this time. Then, unexpectedly, Nancy's head struck something hard. Quickly investigating, she discovered a narrow wooden rod suspended overhead. Evidently it had once been used for dress and coat hangers, as it was fastened to either wall and ran the length of the closet. If I could get that rod down, I might be able to use it to break out a panel of the door, Nancy thought hopefully. It feels strong and it's the right size. She tugged at the rod with all her might. To her satisfaction, one side gave. Another hard jerk brought the rod down on her head. To her bitter disappointment, Nancy found as she examined the rod that it was too long to use as a ram. But after a little experimentation, she discovered that she could press it into service as a wedge. Inserting it in the crack between the hinges, she threw all of her weight against the rod. At first, the door did not budge. Archimedes didn't know what he was talking about when he said the world could be moved with a lever, Nancy murmured. I'd like to see him move this door. As she applied steady pressure to the rod a second time, she saw that the hinges were beginning to give. Encouraged, she applied more force. It's coming, she cried. Once more she threw her weight against the rod. A hinge tore from the casing, and the door sagged. It was now easy to insert the wedge, and Nancy knew success would soon be hers. Then, just as another hinge gave way, she was startled to hear footsteps. Someone came running into the bedroom, and a heavy body hurled itself against the door of the closet. The unexpected action stunned Nancy. Could it be that one of the robbers had heard the noise she had made and had returned to make sure that she did not escape? She discarded the theory as quickly as it came to her. The robbers were far too wise to tarry once their disgraceful work had been accomplished. Too, she heard their moving van leave. Frantically, Nancy rattled the doorknob. "Oh, you is a caged lion this time. You is one of these tough robber boys, is you? Well, you won't do no mo' pilfering, 'cause I done got you surrounded." "Let me out! I'm not a robber." The sound of a feminine voice coming from the closet nonplussed the man. "Say, robber boy, is you imitatin' a lady's voice to throw me off the scent? If you is, it won't do no good, 'cause I's a natural-born two-legged bloodhound." Nancy thought of a way to convince him. She let go her longest and loudest feminine scream. "That's enough! Hold your siren! I'll let you out. There ain't a man in the world could make a racket like that. This way out, lady!"
Expectantly, Nancy waited, but the door did not open. "My lordy," she heard to her horror, "I's done gone and misplaced the key."
This marks the end of Chapter 16. We now move into the next chapter of story, Chapter 17, titled Jeff Tucker's Story.
There was another long wait, and then, to her relief, Nancy Drew heard a key turn in the lock and then a bolt shot back. Quickly, she pushed the closet door open and stepped out into the light. She stood face to face with Jeff Tucker, the colored caretaker employed by the Topums. The robbers had led her to believe that they had harmed the old fellow, and Nancy was glad to see him well and happy, albeit a little too happy, for Jeff Tucker plainly had had a bit too much to drink. Jeff still knew very well what was going on about him, but a certain alcoholic glitter in his eyes and his somewhat unsteady stance informed Nancy that he was not just as sober as the proverbial judge. She suspected that while he had been absent on his convivial celebration, the robbers had made off with the Topum furniture, for even in his condition of semi-inebriety, Jeff seemed to realize that something was amiss. He stared at Nancy, then his eyes roved about the topsy-turvy room. "Say, white girl, you tell me where all dis here furniture is at." Nancy smiled in spite of herself at the old caretaker's bewilderment, for try as he might, he evidently could not rationalize the situation. "The most definite information I can give you," she said, "is that some robbers carted it away. If you had been here attending to your duty, it would never have happened." That's right, blame me. I ain't supposed to be no standing army. I's just a plain colored man with a wife and 7 children a-depending on me. No, Mom, I ain't having no truck with them machine gun boys." Jeff paused and passed his hand over his forehead as if he were trying to wipe away the alcoholic cobwebs that were accumulating about his perceptive faculties. Then suddenly he pointed a bony finger at Nancy and demanded, "How come you here?" "That's a fine question for you to ask," replied Nancy indulgently, "but I don't mind telling you. I arrived just as the robbers were hauling off the last of the furniture. They locked me in the closet. I must have been there for hours." "You was in that closet all that time?" Jeff's voice suddenly took on a pathetic tone. "You poor child. Suppose you had a starved to death in there, or the house had burned down, or you was scared into fits, or—" "There now, Jeff, don't take on about what might have happened to me. I'm all right." Nancy had determined to try persuasion on the old fellow in order to find out what had happened to him. "Tell me where you were last night," she suggested gently. "Well, miss, it was dis here way. I was out there yard a-chorin' round last night and a-thinkin' how I wished I was some place where I wasn't. Just any place, I didn't mind where. I was just all fed up bein' a caretaker and takin' care all dis truck from mornin' till night. It ain't such an excitin' life, miss, and while I's done sowed all my wild oats, I still sows a little rye now and then. Yes, Jeff, I can smell that on your breath right now." Jeff wiped the back of his mouth over his mouth in an apparent effort to keep his rye-laden breath from being propagated into the atmosphere. "You can't blame me, miss," he protested. "He give it to me." "Who is this he?" "Why, dat white man who drives up in the big sedan. He sees me out there and knows how lonesome and useless I feels, so he says, 'Jeff, hop in. I know a place where.' So in I hops. Course I locked up dis here house and the barn and seen that everything was safe. Safe? From the looks of this room, one could hardly call it that. Oh, well, miss, it looked safe, and I felt safe, too, when we whizzed off in that big car. Then dis white man, he says, 'Jeff, how about a little drink?' And I says, 'I don't mind, seeing it's you.' Then I had one and some more, too, I guess, 'cause after a while I didn't feel like I was riding in no automobile at all. I thought that the chariot had done gone and swung low, and I was a-being wafted off to some place in the general direction of heaven." "Well, that was a fine thing to do, I must say," commented Nancy. "Then what happened?"
I comes to. I sees I ain't in no chariot no more, but I's in a hotel, and I's in bed, and I's feelin' powerful sickish-like and discouraged. Well, I gets my clothes on, and I sees my keys to the house has done been pilfered. Then I tries to recollect what done come to pass, and I gets suspicious. I says to myself, Jeff, how come that white man so friendly? How come he'd give you drinks that costs $4 a pint? How come you ain't got no keys? Black boy, bestir yourself. And here I is.
"Oh, yes, you're here, all right," Nancy returned severely. "And a fine mess you've made of it, too. What do you think Mrs. Topham will say when she learns?" Jeff rolled his eyes. "Lawdy, miss, what will she say? I reckon I's done gone and discharged myself." "It would be only what you deserve, Jeff. You were unfaithful to your trust." "What you mean, miss? Trust? I don't trust nobody no mo', especially no footloose white boys a traveling around in sedans." "You don't understand. I mean you didn't treat Mrs. Topham right in going off." "I reckon you's right, miss. Old Jeff done gone and made a fool of himself. I realize that whatever I gets, I's got it a-comin'." A tear rolled out on Jeff's black, furrowed old cheek, and he wiped it away with his handkerchief. "There, Jeff," Nancy said consolingly. "Let's forget about what has been done and think about what we can do to straighten things out. I'll try to help you. We must report the robbery to the police right away. Is there a telephone in the house?" "No, miss. We ain't got no telephone here. We always uses the RFD." "Then we shall have to go to town as quickly as we can in my car. Do you suppose that you would recognize the man who enticed you away, Jeff?" "Say, would I 'member him? I'd recognize that man in a bootleggers' convention. He was tall and slick-looking with a kind of a gimme look in his eyes. Yes, ma'am, I sure would know that baby." Before leading the way to her roadster, Nancy Drew thought of the old Crowley clock again and all that it might mean in the solving of the mystery of the will. Jeff, as caretaker, would surely know whether or not it was in the bungalow before the robbery. "Tell me something, Jeff," Nancy said conflictingly. "Was there an old clock in the house? A tall, square-faced mantel clock?" "Yes, miss, but all I ever done to it was dust it. I never wound it up to see if it would run. I's got a watch of my own." Jeff punctuated his remarks by taking a large, silver, open-faced watch from his pocket and holding it to his ear. "She's done run down, too. I reckon that I was in that hotel when I should have been tending to this watch." "Never mind the watch, Jeff. You're sure there was a clock in the house, then?" "Oh, I's dead rights on that, miss. There sure was. I recollects that clock just as plain as day. I wouldn't forget that clock. No, ma'am, never." Now Nancy felt almost certain that this was the clock which contained the notebook telling of what disposal had been made of the Crowley will, and that it had been stolen by the thieves. She must recover the clock, and there was only one way. The thieves must be apprehended and the stolen goods returned. With this thought in her mind, she rushed out toward her roadster, calling to Jeff to follow. "I's a-comin', miss," Jeff called. "Just a minute." He half-hobbled off behind the house out of Nancy's sight, while Nancy sat waiting impatiently in her roadster. She started the engine and warmed it up, but Jeff still failed to return. She called to him, but there was no response. Finally, she couldn't stand the suspense no longer. Jumping to the ground, she set off to find out what had become of the old scamp. She found Jeff leisurely performing an elaborate facial ablution at the cistern pump. He would pump his hands full of water and then with a great spluttering noise dash it against his face. "For goodness sakes, Jeff," Nancy said, provoked as she came upon him. "Don't you realize I've been waiting for you? Those robbers will probably be in the next state before we even succeed in notifying the police." "Excuse me, miss, but I's taking a little wash." "I see you are, but can't that wait?" "But this here wash is important. I just wants to get good and sober before I goes into that police station, and this cold water is good for what ails me." Coax, wheedle, or threaten, Nancy was unable to hurry Jeff a minute,
But at last he had finished, and Nancy, with a sigh of relief, loaded him into the waiting roadster. As she stepped upon the accelerator and the car moved slowly out onto the highway, she wondered where the old Crowley clock was now and whether she would ever be able to recover it from the thieves.
This marks the end of Chapter 17. We now move into the next chapter of story, Chapter 18, titled Notifying the Police.
It was probably fortunate for Nancy Drew that the traffic police were not patrolling the road, for as she opened the throttle wider and wider, her roadster responded with a surge of power that sent the car along at breathtaking speed. "This old bus can sure step," observed Jeff. "Suppose it turns turtle." "Don't worry, Jeff, it won't. I know this roadster." Nancy Drew did know the limit to which she dared go. She guided the car skillfully, and in a short time they were entering the outskirts of Melbourne, the nearest town to the Topham bungalow. "Better slow down now, miss," Jeff cautioned. "The marshal of this town is mighty persnickety about how folks acts. He's run me in more'n once." "For speeding?" "Nah, just for enjoying myself." "Then I suppose you can tell me where the jail is." "'Deed I can, miss. I sure can. Fact is, this is my favorite jail. You goes right down Central Avenue to Maple Street and turns to the left, and dar you is." The roadster stopped in front of the building with a lurch, and Nancy stepped out briskly, with Jeff following at a more leisurely gait. "I must see an officer," Nancy announced as she entered the office. "I want to report a robbery." A buzzer rang, and soon a marshal, followed by several men, entered. Nancy quickly told them all she knew about the Topham robbery, and to corroborate what she had said, she called Jeff for his version. "She speaks the truth," testified Jeff, "'cept she don't make it strong enough. First thing, they kidnaps me so I won't be around to raise no ruckus. Then they gives me some kind of a sleeping powder and parks me in a hotel. But I comes to and goes back, and dar I find this girl cooped up in a closet, just as she told you. And they wrecked Miss Topham's house and stole all the furniture." The marshal and his men listened attentively and plied Nancy with questions to clear up certain points. "Have you any idea which road they took?" the marshal asked her. "Yes, sir. I examined the tire tracks where the thieves had backed a truck up to the house and noticed the pattern they made in the turf. When we passed the road crossing a few miles out of town, I saw the same tracks just off to the side of the road where they had slipped off in turning their truck northward." "Can you lead the way?" "Yes, I'll do everything in my power to help." The marshal terminated the interview by giving curt orders to his deputies. "Get your automobile started," he directed Nancy. "We'll follow in the police car." "Hurry," Nancy begged as she turned toward the door. "Those men have nearly an hour's start of us now." Hastily, she ran to the street and sprang into the roadster. Starting the motor, she waited impatiently for the marshal and his men to appear. After a seemingly interminable wait, they came out buckling on holsters. They piled into the police car, which stood at the curbing, and the marshal took the wheel. After several unsuccessful attempts, he started the motor. Jeff Tucker, who had followed the men from the office, would have inflicted his person upon the already overburdened car, but as he attempted to gain the running board, he was forced gently but firmly back upon the sidewalk. "Follow me," Nancy cried to the marshal. Shifting gears, she started off down the road. At the corner, she looked back to see that the police car was following and caught a glimpse of Jeff Tucker, who stood gazing mournfully after the departing automobiles. At the edge of town, Nancy selected the road which she felt certain the robbers had taken. Her high-powered roadster was built for speed, and several times she was forced to slow down in order that the marshal and his men might keep her in sight. Nancy had gone perhaps 9 or 10 miles when unexpectedly she came to a fork in the road. Uncertain which branch off to take, she brought the roadster to a halt. The police car pulled up alongside. "What's the matter now?" the marshal called out. "I don't know which way to go." The marshal and his deputies sprang from their automobiles and began to examine the tracks in the road. But if a moving van had passed that way, the tire marks had been obliterated by other vehicles. There was no clue to indicate which route the robbers had selected. "They must have taken the right-hand fork," the marshal hazarded. Nancy shook her head doubtfully. "Doesn't the left-hand road lead to Garwin?" The marshal nodded. "Then it strikes me the robbers would have taken that road. It seems reasonable that they would head for a large city where they could dispose of the stolen goods. Maybe you're right, the marshal admitted reluctantly. I'll tell you what we'll do, Nancy proposed, as she had an inspiration. You take the right-hand road, and I'll head for Garwin. And if you should overtake those rascals, what would you do? The marshal demanded in some amusement. You couldn't expect to stop 'em single-handed. I wouldn't try. I'd race back and give the alarm. Hurry, every minute that we delay gives them just that greater advantage. Without waiting until the marshal had returned to his automobile, Nancy Drew backed her car and headed down the left-hand road. The highway was smooth, and as there was a clear stretch ahead, she drove rapidly. She realized that already the robbers had a big start, and that if once they reached Garwin, she could not hope to overtake them. I'm sure I'm on the right trail, she told herself. That other road doesn't lead anywhere in particular. After she had traveled several miles, Nancy became less confident. Although she had passed a number of side roads, she had kept to the main highway, and she realized that it would have been easy for the moving van to elude pursuit by taking any one of the branches. Still, the robbers can't know that they're being followed, she reasoned. It's likely they'll be off their guard. 15 minutes passed, and Nancy began to fear that after all she had selected the wrong road at the fork. Presently, as she noticed a man with a team of horses approaching, she determined to question him. "Have you seen a large moving van on this road?" she called out as she stopped the roadster alongside the wagon. "A truck passed me about 20 minutes ago," the farmer told her. "The big road hog tried to push me into a ditch." Highly elated at the information, Nancy thanked the farmer and drove on. "At the rate I'm going, I should overtake the robbers in a few minutes. Oh, if only I could get my hands on the Crowley clock before the police confiscate the stolen goods." 10 minutes passed, and then another 10. As Nancy gazed anxiously down the road, she could see no sign of the moving van. "I've missed them somewhere," she decided, in disappointment. "There's nothing to do but go back." Nancy Drew recalled the fact that she had passed a roadhouse less than a mile back, and it occurred to her that possibly the robbers had stopped there. "I'll go back there and make inquiry," she thought. "I haven't gone by a single crossroads since I talked with that farmer, so if the robbers didn't stop at the roadhouse, I can't imagine what became of them. If they were on this road, I am certain I would have passed them by this time." Dusk was approaching, and Nancy Drew knew that if she were ever to find the robbers, it must be within the next hour. Skillfully, she turned the roadster around in the road. A few minutes of fast driving brought her within sight of the roadhouse. The place was of disreputable appearance, and Nancy suspected that it might be a bad resort to visit. It stood back from the road a short distance and was half hidden by tall trees. The building was large and rambling, but rather old and sadly in need of paint. A sign on the gate read, "The Black Horse." Beyond the inn, Nancy caught a glimpse of a garage and a large stable. She did not enter the private driveway which led to the inn, but stopped her car at the side of the road. Before starting to walk towards the roadhouse, she hesitated. "I don't like to go in there, but there's no other way," she decided. She walked briskly up the path, glancing about in all directions for a sign of a moving van. The door of the garage was closed, as was the door of the barn, and the thought occurred to her that perhaps the robbers had parked their van inside one of the buildings. As she drew near the inn, she approached cautiously. As she stepped upon the veranda, coarse laughter reached her ears. She tiptoed to a window and peered inside. What she saw caused her to start in surprise. In a dingy, dimly lighted room, 3 men were seated about a table, obviously engaged in a drinking orgy. They were the 3 men who had robbed the Topham bungalow. This marks the end of Chapter 18. We now move into the next chapter of story, Chapter 19, titled A Risky Undertaking.
"I must notify the marshal at once," Nancy Drew told herself as she recognized the 3 robbers. Turning away from the window, she crept noiselessly from the porch and as soon as she was a safe distance from the inn, broke into a run. As she stepped into her roadster, a sudden thought occurred to her. Those robbers must have parked their van in the garage back of the inn. If only I could get my hands on the clock before I notify the police. Once the marshal takes charge of the stolen goods, I'll have no opportunity. Motivated by the impulse, Nancy drove on down the road a short distance and, rounding a bend, came up on another side road which led into the woods directly behind the inn. Stopping the roadster where it would be hidden by the trees, she got out and hurried through the timber. Before leaving the car, she had secured her flashlight, for already it was growing dark. Cautiously, she approached the inn from the rear. Reaching the garage, she found the doors closed, but investigation disclosed that they had not been locked. She opened one of the doors and looked inside. There was no sign of a truck, only a battered old Ford car. They must have parked the van in the barn, she decided. As she opened the stable door, it squeaked in an alarming fashion. Anxiously, she glanced toward the inn, but so far as she could tell, her actions were unobserved. There was no one in sight. Flinging the door wide, the girl peered hopefully into the dark interior. A low cry escaped from her lips. There, in front of her, stood the moving van. "What a piece of luck!" she exclaimed, as she viewed the truck which the robbers had left in the barn. "Now if I can only find the clock." With a last cautious glance in the direction of the roadhouse, she hastily closed the barn door, lest it swing in the wind and attract attention. With the doors shut, the interior of the barn was dark. As Nancy switched on her automobile flashlight and played it over the moving van, she was disappointed to note that it was a covered one. The rear doors were closed. Nevertheless, although she could not see inside, she was certain the truck contained the goods stolen only a few hours before from the Topham bungalow. Securing a firm grip on the door handle, she gave it a quick turn. To her surprise, the door did not open. With an exclamation of disappointment, Nancy turned her flashlight on it and for the first time noticed the keyhole. The robbers had locked the van. "Oh dear, now what shall I do?" she questioned frantically. "I'll never be able to break the lock." Desperately, she glanced about. She dared not remain many minutes in the barn lest the robbers return and find her there. Yet she could not admit defeat. Perhaps the keys were left in the ignition switch, she thought hopefully. She rushed to the front of the van and clambered into the driver's seat. An examination of the dashboard did not reveal the keys hanging from the ignition switch. The robbers must have taken the keys with them, she told herself. Nancy was discouraged. She was on the point of admitting defeat when a thought came to her. Among her acquaintances, there were a number of persons who, on occasion, hid their automobile keys under the front seat. It was barely possible that the robbers had done likewise. Nancy hastily pulled up the leather seat and looked underneath. A ray of her flashlight illuminated a small object in one corner. Eagerly, she snatched it up and saw that it was a key ring. "Luck was with me once," she murmured as she ran back to the rear of the van. After trying several of the keys, at last she found one which would fit the lock. Turning it, she jerked open the door. As she flashed her light about inside the truck, she had made no mistake. The van contained the stolen goods, and it was loaded nearly to the top. "What shall I do if the clock is on the bottom?" Nancy groaned as another problem occurred to her. "I'll never find it." Dexterously, she swung herself up on the load. She flashed the light about on chairs, tables, rugs, and boxes. There was no sign of the Crawley clock. Then the beam rested for a moment on an object in a far corner, and with a low cry of delight, Nancy saw that her search had been rewarded. Protected by a blanket, an old-fashioned mantel clock rested on top of a center table in the very front of the van. She scrambled laboriously over odd pieces of furniture as she tried to reach the clock. Her dress caught on something sharp and tore, but Nancy did not heed it. She snatched at the blanket and swept the clock toward her. One glance at the timepiece assured her that it fit the description Abigail Rowan had given her. It had a square face, and the top was ornamented with a crescent. Nancy was almost certain that it was the Crawley clock. But as she stood staring at it, her keen ears detected the sound of voices outside the barn. The robbers were coming back. "I'm lost," flashed through her mind. Clutching the blanket and the clock tightly in her arms, Nancy partly crawled and partly fell over objects as she struggled to get out of the truck before it was too late. She was afraid to think what would happen to her if the robbers discovered her in the van. Reaching the door, she leapt lightly to the floor. She could now hear heavy footsteps coming closer and closer. Nancy slammed the truck doors shut and searched wildly for the keys. "Oh, what did I do with them?" she thought frantically. She saw that they had fallen from the door to the floor and snatched them up. Hurriedly inserting the right key in the lock, she secured the doors. The deed was not accomplished a minute too soon. As Nancy wheeled about, she distinctly heard the murmur of angry voices outside. The robbers were quarreling among themselves, and already someone was working at the fastening of the barn door. Escape was cut off. Nancy felt that she was cornered. "Oh, what shall I do?" she thought in despair.
This is the end of part 3. The Secret of the Old Clock story continues, and we will carry on in the next video. Thank you for listening, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. See you in part 4 of the story.